I was 20 years old. I was in America visiting my sister, and I was deeply, deeply depressed. And I was so depressed that I was beginning to get some really dark, let's say, dangerous thoughts. And I shudder to think at where I would be now had I not had that initial conversation, which was such a huge weight lifted off me. It was 4 years after I'd been raped. And at that point, until this very conversation, I hadn't told a single soul at all in terms of the detail around what actually happened. I was incredibly naive kid. Even at 20, I was very naive. And I still believed that in order to be able to classify a scene like I'd experienced as rape, it had to be from a complete stranger. You get jumped down an alley, you get tied up in ropes and chains, and they beat you up and then they violate you. I didn't think it was legally possible to even consider that you could say this happened by a boyfriend. And I think I said in one of my other videos, in my defense, the law only changed in 1993, if you can believe that. That was when I was 13, that it became illegal for a husband to be able to rape a wife. And this happened when I was 16. And I'm not exactly going to be studying the sexual law at that stage of my life. But even so, in my head, I'd only ever heard that there's no way that a partner could call rape against the partner, basically. But I remember being in America. I remember my sister basically saying she'd never seen me like this before, and she insisted that we had a conversation, which happened on her balcony. And I didn't know how to tell this story because there was no words that I could find other than just descriptive words. So I basically just described what happened beforehand, what happened during, and what happened afterwards. I remember leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, and I just had my head down because I just couldn't barely bring myself to talk about this thing. It was so uncomfortable, but I knew that I shudder to think where my life was going if I didn't talk about it at all. And when I finished telling the story, I then looked up and I saw her face, and she was also had her elbows on her knees and leaning forward, but she was kind of like this cupping her face, and her eyes were absolutely streaming. Like I had no idea, but she'd been pretty much silently sobbing all the way through this story as this very naive 20-year-old, as in me, that I was describing a really violent rape scene. I'm sharing this now not to humiliate myself. I'm sharing this to show how some people can be so coercively controlled, especially with what happened afterwards and what he said and what he did, and which I also shared with my sister as well. She was naturally very upset and very angry, very sad. But when I told her this and she said it was rape, initially I started pushing back and saying it's impossible for it to be rape. He was my boyfriend at the time. She was like, it doesn't matter. And it was at this moment that I realized the enormity of what I was actually dealing with and what had actually happened to me. At the time, I thought, well, it's 4 years ago now. I can't go to the police. Who's going to believe me now? And in the 90s, I think rape was treated differently than it is now. And it is taken more seriously now. And I was so young and so insecure that I didn't think there was anything I could do about it anyway, because by the time I was telling my sister, it was 4 years after. I thought, well, what can I do now? It's so late. Which is the irony behind this story, right? Because obviously, it's after 23 years after it happened is when I went to the police. My sister was encouraging me to go to the police, and I point blank refused and just said, they're not going to believe me. It's too late. I'm just going to have to deal with it. Very classic, reactions as a rape survivor of how most people tend to deal with it. They just want to push it away, forget it happened. But the body just doesn't work that way. You can't just forget it, which is why I was in the emotional, horrendous state at the time when I told my sister. And I think this conversation was monumental for me because it was the first time in my life at that point that I wasn't carrying this horrible thing that happened to me on my own. I actually had somebody to be there with me on it and to be able to explain to me why I felt as horrendous as I did. I've made other videos around how I told my other remaining family members, and this conversation was different because by the time I told my parents and my brother, I was already in my 40s and I was already quite deeply into the justice system. So I was already ready to fight. I was already in that place of fighting. Whereas at the point when I told my sister, I was absolutely broken. And again, the reason why I'm sharing this, because for some people it might be like, why the hell is she sharing this? Because I know that other people out there are feeling this way. I know other people are battling with it. I speak to survivors intermittently, somewhat fairly frequently. So I'm not guessing that people are still dealing with it. I know that there are, and I've only touched this amount of the market in terms of the people that are struggling with it versus the amount of people that are really out there. So I guess I'm just making this video because I'm very aware that the majority of silent survivors that are out there don't go to the police. At first, my intention was all about getting information about the justice system to prepare people that are in the justice system and maybe encourage some extra people to get into the justice system. But actually, the majority of people won't go near the justice system, and those people are possibly living in this type of world. And I know firsthand how difficult that is. And the reason why I'm going into this much depth around how I was feeling is not some bloody pity party. On the contrary, I feel very strong these days, and I don't get anything like those types of thoughts anymore. I don't talk about it that much to people whenever this conversation comes up around the assault. But of a few that I've got into conversation with that I have mentioned it, a high proportion of that few have said, yeah, I remember feeling like that. I remember getting to that stage. And I don't know if it's everybody's story. I'm not in a position to ever make that judgment, but I know for a fact it's many people's story and it was most definitely mine. And I also believe that there's other people out there still in that place, people that haven't told anybody, people that still doubt that they will be believed, people that are carrying it on their own. And I talk a lot around the cost of silence. And this is an example of the cost of silence. It nearly cost me my life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And this conversation was a huge shift in that process of healing. The irony of it is that the person that I was telling was the one and only person on this planet that never liked that man ever. I mean, everybody else that knew him liked him. My friends liked him. My football team liked him. My swimming club liked him. My family liked him, apart from my sister. She's never liked him. And yet she never said, I told you so. But it was a very unspoken, I told you so moment between us because she always warned me away from him when I was dating him and everything. Anyway, if you've got a big sister, listen to them. They're normally right. And it's worth me adding as well, I've mentioned a few times on my videos around how I believe that the family of a survivor are actually the silent casualties or the collateral damage that comes off the back of something like this happening. I mean, in reflection now as an adult, I can look back and think that must have been a huge burden for my sister to have to carry for nearly 20 years before I went to the police from the first time I told her. It's not a reason not to share it. I'm just illustrating that so many people think that the pain is exclusively around the survivor, and actually there's a lot more collateral damage of people that are affected by this thing happening. And the damage caused isn't just with one person, it's with a whole number of people around that person as well. It does feel a bit uncomfortable to share such depth, but I still believe it's necessary and it has a place on this channel because the majority of survivors don't go into the justice system. The majority of survivors stay away from the justice system, which means the majority of survivors are going through this on their own, or are going through this privately, or going through this silently. And I want people to listen to this and realize that there is hope at the end of the road and there is light at the end of the tunnel, and actually it doesn't need to stay this way, and it won't stay this way if you go in that journey. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying I'm not suggesting for a second that by speaking to one or two people, if you are a completely silent survivor, is going to completely heal you. Often there's more to it than that. There certainly was for me anyway. But what I can say with certainty is that 4 years of complete silence nearly killed me. And I say that pretty much literally as well. But in that moment, once I shared it, it meant that from that moment onwards, I wasn't dealing with it completely, exclusively alone anymore. And I didn't feel so isolated with it anymore. And although I had a hell of a healing journey ahead of me, that conversation, without question, was the start of it.